All right. All right. All right. Cool. So I am close this. All right. Awesome. So what's up, everybody? Like I just mentioned, I am excited to just be back in here, kind of just talking to y'all about these interesting topics in React. Last session, we talked a lot about props and last session, excuse me, we talked about state and talked a little bit about the ways in which you can use state in React to keep track of data that's going to change over time due to actions happening inside of your components. And prior to that, we talked about in the session previous to that one, we talked about props, which is a way to pass data into your components and essentially share information from one component to another component. So state and props are two of the most important concepts in React. Matter of fact, they're probably like the biggest concepts you need to understand when you're getting used to working within React. And they might be also the most difficult to wrap your head around as you're getting started. So super important concepts that definitely take a little bit of time to like let sink into your perspective of what's going on with the code and what you're working on. But ultimately, I want you to take away two things. State and props are all about data, and the way in which they interact with data is what makes them different. State is for data that's going to be changing over time. Like whenever you have data that you expect to change, or at one point it's going to be something and it's going to be something else at another point, that's probably going to use state. And then data that you don't need to change, but more data that you want to pass from another component to another component is going to use props. So I think the best way to remember the difference between the two is that, right? State is always about data that's going to be changing, and props is always about data that you're going to be passing from one component into another component. So when you're working on your projects and you're thinking about whether I need to use state or whether I need to use props, you want to ask yourself those two questions and figure out which makes the most sense. And there's a whole framework for thinking about how to there's a whole framework for thinking about how do I structure projects in React. As a matter of fact, on the reactjs.org website, if we go to the docs, which at this point we should be pretty familiar with, in the main concepts, there's a section in here called Thinking in React, which is all about ways in which React projects end up getting structured. So in this article, which I won't go over in detail right now, they talk a lot about how you would think about creating a website that's going to use React. And it starts with this idea of a mock-up, of course, right? Like visually, what do you want to see on the screen? And once you have this idea of like, oh, maybe I want to build an app with a search bar and some small little table of some sort, right? The article talks about like, say you're getting data back as well, right? Or something like that. But the most important part I wanted to mention is with React, this idea of creating your web apps starts from this idea of thinking about what we call a component hierarchy. And a component hierarchy is essentially thinking about what inside of this web app is going to be its own component, right? And that is an interesting question to think about, what parts of a web app would be a component, right? In the case of this little application that they're giving you as an example, this might be the component breakdown, right? So we might have like this light orange box is maybe like a container for the entire application. And inside of that container, we have two other components. We have this one in blue, we have this one in green. And inside of the one in blue, there's a couple components, as well as inside of the one in green, there's a couple of components, right? And in doing this component breakdown this way, this will allow us to have a hierarchy of components that will allow us to represent this seemingly simple, but maybe a little complicated code in a more easy to understand way in the actual code base. So if you scroll down, they talk about those different sections and give them names as components, right? So what I call the container, they call filterable product table, right? What in blue, they created a component that they called search bar. The green, they called product table, a component called product table. And inside of the green, there's this like light blue, and there's the red. The light blue turquoise is called product category row, and the red is product row, right? And so this article kind of breaks down not only why they define these components this way, but also thinking about now that you have this hierarchy, right? So if we looked at the kind of hierarchy in like also like a tree-like structure, clearly this tree would start with the filterable product table, or this big orangish container as like the main component inside of the app. That probably is the one that's rendered in the app.js as well, right? And that component will contain the other components. And so that breakdown would look something like this, where we would have this main component that would be in our app.js getting returned. And inside of there, we might have inside of this file, right? Because this might be its own file, filterable product table.js or something. We have another set of components like the search bar and the product table. And the components inside of the product table might include the product category row and the actual row, right? So each component might have components inside of it that make it up, but all of them would return some JSX, and eventually all of them would be rendered within this filterable product table, which would be put into our app.js and eventually shown to us on our website. This article talks about how you could use React to build these things. And I think it even goes through the code also, or maybe it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Just kidding. But one of the things that this article does talk about, which was the reason I brought it up in the first place, is this brief interlude on props versus state. And so thinking about when would you use these different, like which of these components would make use of props and which would make use of state is an actual question that you have to answer. And so they talk a little bit in this article about how would you start thinking about the data flow in this application to realize which components might need to use state and which components might need to use props, right? And so in order to do that, you're going to have to think about what data is going to be used in this application. What am I going to need to represent in a data format? And you can ask yourself some questions that will help you figure out whether or not that data is related to something in state or whether it's related to something in props, right? So question number one is this data going to be passed in from a parent, right? If the data is being passed in from a parent, it's probably going to be props. So it's probably not going to be state, right? Does the data remain unchanged over time? Do I need to change it at all? If I don't, then I probably don't need to use state, right? Can I find this data out by using any other state or props? If so, I probably don't need state. I could probably just use props, or I could probably use that other state instead of creating another state data object for this, right? So it talks about how in this example, they passed in an original list of products as props, so it's not state. And then they kind of go through each of the components to recognize which need to use state and which need to use props. And I think it's a great example in terms of just walking you through the process of thinking about React and thinking about breaking up your websites and components, and then thinking about which components would need state and which components would need props. But again, like I mentioned, it's not a easy question to answer, because you also got to think about, if I'm going to be using state, where should the state be? Which component should be relying on state? And it talks a lot about how with state, the idea is that state relies on the component that defines it. So you need to really understand, where do you want to define state, and where do you want to define, where you define the state is important for the entire application if you're going to be passing that data around, for instance. So we'll talk a little bit about that in example that I'll show you all today. And then the homework example that I'll give y'all in terms of like a feasible project that you can work on related to this is also going to kind of give you some good examples of that. So just be on the lookout for that in a little bit. Essentially though, thinking about state, you want to really kind of understand that state is changing the specific data inside of one component. Props is the data that would get passed from a component to another component. Sometimes we use both, and we create something where some component that is using state also might be using props to pass data to another component. And that's where things get a little interesting, but also a little challenging to understand with React, is that scenario where a component is responsible for maintaining some state, but also is responsible for passing data to another component as well. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to necessarily build out this example that they're talking about here, but we will build out an example that can show us this idea in practice, excuse me. And we get a little bit more familiar with this idea of state, props, and their overlaps in certain applications and where you might see an application that is making use of both state and props. So yeah, that's kind of a preface to what I wanted to talk about. And in order to do so, I'm going to make use of this old repo that I created, the components repository. From the last session, I remember I had made a separate branch just to show you all some interesting stuff with GitHub. I've since pushed that code from the development branch to the main branch. So if you go to the main branch, you should be able to see the interesting stuff we did with state the other day inside of some of these components, but also those old components that we were using props with are still here in this folder for props as well. So we're going to kind of continue building out on this code base. First, we'll do a kind of review of where it's at currently. And then after that, we'll kind of just start from scratch. I might move some of those files into another folder, and then we kind of just start from scratch. So cool. Doing this walkthrough, I'll do it right here in GitHub before I pull up the VS Code, but essentially same kind of default create React app starting point. We have our app.js in here. The app.js currently is working with one particular component called mood. That component was the component we created the last session when we were working with state. That component essentially is a small component that is, in essence, it's a class-based component, and it is using state. So we talked about state several times last session, as well as earlier just now. And the main idea about state is that it's data that changes internal to a component. So it's data that a component has access to that it can also change over time. And the way that state is created is interesting in that it is different how it's created in a functional component versus in a class-based component. I told y'all last session that in a class-based component, state is a little bit easier to work with. And that's one of the reasons why people recommend that you learn about class-based components before you kind of dive into functional components too much. There's ways to use state and functional components by way of another topic in React that you can find in the docs called hooks. That's located here. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but I wanted y'all to really get a sense of how state works and props work. And it turns out that learning about them via the class-based components make things a little bit easier to understand in general. So in the class-based component, the way that you use state is pretty straightforward. First thing you have to do is initialize the state in your component somewhere. And typically where we do this is inside of the constructor function. So remember, the constructor function is a function that's built into the class-based components. And all you have to do is kind of write out the constructor function. You call super so you can initialize the main component from the base component that it's inheriting from. And then you can like write whatever code you want, right? In this case, and in the case that you're working with a class-based component that you need state in, what you're probably going to need to do is initialize the state. And this is done by using this keyword, this.state, in order to set it equal to a JavaScript object that contains the state variables and the keys and values that you want to save. So state is an object in JavaScript, and an object in JavaScript always is created with key value pairs. So in this case, whatever key is the key that you're going to that's the key you're saving onto the state, and then you'll use that key to look up the value, and you set the key and the value when you initialize the state. So here in this constructor on line 10, you can see that I'm setting a state variable called mood that is set to this value unknown. And later, I make use of that state inside of my render statement, right? I checked it out, console logged it just to make sure it was printing. But then this state.state.mood is used inside of this render function this like separate render message function that I've created that is getting returned inside of the main component rendering, right? So this render message was really a function we created so that this heading that we have here, this h1 tag, instead of having a fixed value for like the message, we're passing in a function that's going to render for us. So one of the unique things about working with JSX is that you can pass JavaScript into the JSX elements, both as props and attributes, like we're seeing here, but also as data. So inside of the h1 tag, we know that normally within an h1 tag, we have text, right? So technically within these this JavaScript expression is returning some text for us. So if I look at the render message function, I can see that this function is responsible for returning some text and in certain conditions. So in the condition that I know what this.state.mood is, this function will return a specific text. If it's unknown, it returns a specific text. If it knows that it's good, it's going to return a specific text. Otherwise, it's going to return something else. So all in all, this is just a simple kind of conditional logic that's returning different strings based on what the value of this.state.mood is, which is exactly the very value that we set initially to be unknown. The thing I mentioned earliest about state was that state is data that can change though. And working with class-based components, changing the state is very simple as well. There's a function built into classes that you can use called setState. And setState is a function that basically takes in the new state that you want to pass in. So you can use setState to change values of anything that was currently inside, anything in the state. It doesn't have to even currently be defined. If we didn't have mood defined initially and we set state and added it here, it would just add it to the state. So it'll change any existing state objects that we have. So if we do have, since we do have mood defined here, what this function on line 15 does, as well as this function on line 21, is it looks for what was set as state for before, and it just updates it. But like I'm trying to mention is essentially, if we didn't have any, if we were kind of setting, if we set this.setState with a new state variable called random, and random was set to set of numbers, right? I could add that here into this.setState call, and it'll just add that value random into my state for me. So setState is a really important function that relies, that essentially communicates what values should be saved into the state at different moments in time. And this is the flow for how we would normally work with state as a class-based component. Certain functions inside of the class would be doing some logic, and in that logic, you might do some setState calls. The setState call really just changes the state. And we saw it last time when we were running the application, that when we did use the setState call, it re-rendered the application. So this part here re-rendered. So when it re-rendered, right, that means that it went through this entire kind of flow, and it created this base kind of JSX that was going to be returned on the screen. And it got to this point with this render message that it said, oh, hey, you want me to run this JavaScript function for you? Got it, I'll do that. And the first time it runs, right, the constructor call setState is, this.state is set to unknown with the mood. And so the first time the render message runs, it checks this if statement, and it says, if this.state.mood is equal to unknown, which it is set to as a default, then it's going to return, hey, how are you feeling today, as the message inside of this heading, right? Which is really what we want. Until the user presses these buttons, I don't want this message to change. But we have these two buttons here. We kind of talked a little bit about how we can add event handlers to our JSX elements, and those event handlers allow us to pass functions in that can get called at different moments inside of the when those elements are being interacted with. So for instance, with this button, with buttons, normally you have an event handler called onClick, and onClick is called whenever a button gets tapped on. And you can pass, just like we're doing here, a JavaScript function in to be called whenever this button gets clicked. I define two functions because I have two buttons. One is called onFeelingGoodPressed, and the other is called onFeelingPressed. And both of those have two arrow functions that I defined up here that will get called when either button gets pressed. And all these functions doing is really simple right now. It's just setting the state to be something different, right? So that means that whenever this function actually runs, when this component renders and any of these buttons get pressed, this stop on whatever those functions are, on feeling good press or on feeling ed press, get run and set the state to something different. When the state gets set to something different, the React is smart enough to say, oh, you changed the state? Okay, cool. I'm going to re-render this component for you. So this component re-renders, right? And when it re-renders, it runs this render function again. And when it reruns that function, we get the same kind of base JSX to get created. The heading is getting created and it says, hey, you want to run this render message function. And it's like, okay, cool. Then the render message function gets called again and it asks us, hey, is this that state that mood unknown? Well, if we press one of these buttons, the mood is either going to be good or right? It's not going to be unknown anymore as it was as a default, right? So it's going to say, no, it's not unknown. So we're going to come into this else block and is going to check whether it's good or not. And if it is, it's going to return this message for when you're feeling good and this message for when you're not feeling so good, right? And that is how our little application is running. And yeah, that's really kind of the how this whole thing kind of is set up and how the state side of things is working. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll definitely explain whatever it is that you're thinking about. Appreciate that. But I wanted to also go over, just for the sake of time, I wanted to go over some stuff with regards to props as well, just to recap that. But the state stuff is really interesting in that, you know, we can initialize it. And when we initialize it, we're able to set the state to something else over time as the component is running and working and whatnot. And yeah, that's essentially how this whole thing is set up. So the main point of using state is to ensure that whatever data that you have defined can change over time. And that's what makes it interesting. And that's what makes it kind of unique in relationship to props, which we'll talk about in kind of just a little bit more detail in a second. So the next thing I wanted to touch on real quick to just kind of get this ball rolling in relationship to what we got to know for this new little side project we'll work on is the prop stuff. And I already had the prop stuff kind of put into some components that we talked on a couple sessions ago. And the main idea of props is that props are data that you're expecting to get back from another component. So in essence, with props, right, a component is going to get props passed into it. So one of the cool things about Git is that one of the things that is interesting about Git, right, is that you have this history to it. So I can go back to the main code base and look at these 5 commits. Clearly, I had some information on props that was in a previous commit. So I can go back to this version of the code by browsing the files on GitHub and see the code base that we had when we were running the application to mess around with props. So in this case, the idea that we used with props was we had a specific component called message, and we also played around with this component called hello, and we gave them both props. And so the idea of props is that props are data that one component, our app component, passes into separate components. So the app component is passing props into hello and to message, right? It's passing some content into it. It's passing this sender object into it, right? And in the case of the hello component, it's passing this date into it, right? All of these props are JavaScript objects, right? And we wrap them in curly braces and pass a JavaScript expression in the curly braces. Important to note is that you can pass any JavaScript data type in here. So you can pass numbers, you can pass strings like we're doing here. And what we'll talk about today, which is something that you just need to know that you can do, is that you can also pass functions as props. And passing a function as a prop is a really interesting thing that you do when you are trying to accomplish a specific kind of paradigm within your components, where one component gets a function as a prop that it can call and use almost like a callback function. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And the idea is that with regards to how props work, right? So clearly, like I'm mentioning, one component defines the prop and passes it into another component, right? So here in this app component, we're defining these props here as we're passing them into these messages. The message component, if we looked at the message component, right, the message component is expecting there to be some props already defined, and by way of checking for them, then it can use it creatively in its own set of functions in its own rendering. So with regards to the render function here, right, this render function and this message component is also doing some conditional logic. It's checking to see if this.props.content exists. And if this.props.content exists, then it's going to return a specific thing. Otherwise, it's going to return something else, right? And this is the kind of main idea of state and props, is that we use them both to allow us to do this really interesting thing in React called conditional rendering, which is the process of, instead of returning something very straightforward and static, we can return something that is a little bit more dynamic and will change over time or change based on what the data it was passed into is. And that's what allows us to make our components really structured for to be dynamic instead of super static. And so, yeah, the difference between props and state, though, is clearly props are passed down from one component to another component. And unlike state, you can't change props. There's no function that allows you to change the props. So in order to make use of, when you're thinking about whether you're going to make use of props or state, you have to ask yourself, hey, is the data in this regard going to change? If it is, I'm probably going to need to use state. If it's not, then I probably can use props. And that is important to just understand the differences between those two things. And so, yeah, that's kind of a recap of like props and state and how they're kind of set up, how we work with them in these class-based components for to start. And we'll talk about how we work with them in functional components a little bit more specifically in a couple of weeks. Props in functional components is a little bit more straightforward. State within functional components is a little bit more involved because we have to use hooks in order to use state. And that is not necessarily the hardest thing, but it's a little bit more work than just creating a class-based component when you're working with state. So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about those other things in a few. But yeah, what I wanted to do in order to just kind of switching gears here is to kind of go through an example of another kind of practical example of an application. And this application will use a little bit of state. It'll also use a little bit of props, and we'll see some of these interesting things like I'm talking about with regards to one component using props that might get passed to another component, as well as this idea of maybe passing functions as props in general, to see kind of how that flow works. So So one of the questions that I got in the chat, I just want to touch on real quick. If I go back to this main branch and go to the components, the mood component that we were just talking about earlier with regards to the props, was about how we can make these code a little bit more cleaned up. And instead of creating, instead of having to create two different functions here, we can try to like save up on function calls. And there are ways that we can condense this into one function instead of having to call an on feeling and on feeling good pressed. We could just call one maybe function to handle the press. The thing is that at this point in time, when this button is getting clicked, we don't know what the state is. And there's three possibilities. There's the possibility that it's unknown, there's the possibility that it's good, and there's a possibility that it's set to eh. And because we don't know whether it's set to good or set to eh, or even set to unknown, we kind of have to assume that it's set to something that it's not necessarily set to one of those things. We got to kind of play the case that it's set to any of them, which is why this if statement is so complicated right now. There are ways that we could restructure this application for sure, so that we don't need to use so many functions here, and that this kind of if statement is a little bit nicer to read. And I definitely encourage y'all to try your hand at refactoring this code base. One thing we could use here, maybe use a switch statement instead of a if else kind of thing. And with regards to these functions, there's ways that we can set values to the buttons so that it knows that, hey, when this button gets called, instead of it having to call a very specific function, maybe it sets a value that's important for the function to know, and that gets passed into that main function that gets called. So there's ways to consolidate. I definitely encourage y'all to take a look at it. But this is definitely the easiest way to go about it. If you don't know how to consolidate it, is just make separate functions, but also keep a if else kind of conditional that is doing what you expect it to do. So just wanted to touch on that point. And yeah, so let's switch gears a little bit. I'm gonna still use this same repo, but I'm just gonna kind of clean it up a little bit. So let me open up VS Code. We're seeing the same files that we just saw, so I'm not gonna walk through those, but what I am gonna do is just kind of give myself a fresh start real quick. And so I'm going to just delete this, this mood function from, well, first thing I'm gonna do actually is I'm gonna just switch over to my development branch because, and oh yeah, you probably are like, oh, what did he just do? Well, VS Code also has an integration for Git. So I can also interact with Git without using the terminal. If I'm using VS Code, I can like click on this button down here that says the Git branch icon and very easily switch branches. So since I already have a branch created called development from last class, I'm just gonna swap over to that branch. You could use the VS Code helpful shortcuts to create these new branches and stuff like that for you as well, which is good to know sometimes when you're just trying to do things quick. But you know, most times I end up using the terminal anyway. But yeah, I'm just switching over to development just so that these changes I make, I can push to development, and then when I'm finally done, I can push them to the main branch when they're finished. But yeah, first thing I'm gonna do, just kind of clean this up, get rid of any extra stuff. I'm not gonna be making use of these components anymore, hello and message. So I could leave them commented out, but I'm gonna just leave them commented out for now, and maybe I'll delete them at the end because I'm not really using them. And I guess I'll delete them because you have versions, y'all just saw, if you wanna see an old version of this app that was using the props, or you wanna see the one using the state, you could just go back to the previous commits inside of the GitHub to kind of just take a look at the application at those different moments. So I'm actually going to delete this, but before I do that, let me put this back. Let me put this back, and then I'm gonna just create another folder in here. Whoops. I'm gonna say for state, move the mood folder, move the move thing in there. And that should prompt me to update these imports. I'm gonna say yes, it's just gonna import and just update this import for me, which is cool. Now I'm gonna comment this out, save this, and I'm gonna delete this because I don't need that. So now my app component is pretty clean. Save this. And cool, I should be looking at something very basic. just to test, what I'm going to do is extend this a couple lines and just say a fresh start. Save this, and my linter is just putting it on one line because I didn't need it to be on separate lines, so that's fine. But what I will do is, while I'm in here, just going to run npm start to start the project up, switch over to this Chrome window so that it opens up over here, and we should just see that fresh start pop up as confirmation. While that's doing that, I'm gonna grab some water. Gotta stay hydrated out here as engineers. It's a big fact. Okay, so it didn't open up on this one, but it opened up on my other browser that I can see. So let me just pull up localhost on here. And voila, we're back in the lab, hacking and hacking and hacking. All right, wonderful. So we got this app cleaned up, fresh start, ready to go. And it's almost as if we just created a new project, right? Because this is kind of what happens. I have this components folder, so maybe I'll add some new components into this. But in general, we're kind of at a good first place. So let's talk a little bit about this little application that I'm going to create. So what I'm going to do is close these old tabs, and I'm going to open a new tab just so I have a space to draw. And essentially, let's just think about what this application is going to do, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we'll build it. So what I really want to create is an application that is responsible for essentially taking in some data from a form. And when it takes in some data, I just kind of want to list the data on the screen as like a list of items. And so if we kind of drew this, let me see, let me annotate. I want to basically create an application, right? So let's say this is the web page, this yellow web page, right? And inside of that application, I kind of want to have a form. So the form will be like kind of here in blue. Maybe inside of the form, we'll have a little like kind of search bar, like little like input box, right? And that inside of that form also, we might have a little button for people to submit, right? And then the more important kind of aspect of this app will be that there will be kind of like this little section underneath that has a variety of little kind of data, right? So as we kind of type in here in the search bar, the data will kind of get added to this list that we see down there. That's kind of what I'm imagining this app will be, a really simple kind of like list of data that we get from this form. So just looking at this, right, it's kind of interesting. And like, if you think about that whole thinking and React section of the React docs that we talked about, you might be having your gears turn a little bit as to what's the component hierarchy going to look like for this, and what is kind of the way in which we'll build this out to use state and props, right? Which components might need to use state and which components might need to use props. If you have an idea of which might you need to use which, feel free to drop it in the chat and confirm your suspicion in a couple of minutes as we continue to build this John out. But before we go into just building it out, now that I have this little mock-up, I think it's important to think about naming some of these components so that we can kind of work with them with a name. So the big yellow box, I'm going to call, the big yellow box, I'm going to call the form container, right? So the form container is going to contain all of the application involving our form and the data in the list of data, right? So that's going to be our form container, right? And Also, I'm going to have a, so clearly inside of the form container, we're gonna need to have the form. So the form, I'm gonna just call it like form in general. Yeah, I'll just call it form. I think that makes sense because we have a form container. So we'll have the form as a component, which will be this blue component. And inside of there, that component might have, that might be where we have the little input that is going to be related to like filling in the data, right? So that's this little input. And then underneath that, this might be a little button. So that's kind of cool. But then this little white box section here, we're going to call the, let's say, list. No, list sounds boring. So I'm going to say, maybe we make this like an app about tasks, right? So we call this like the task list. And so we have the form, and then we have like the task list, and the form will probably take in little tasks, and then we'll return those items in this little task list of sorts. So form container, and let's see. Just to make it kind of feel a little bit more like everything kind of makes a lot of sense. Let's call this the task container. And inside of here, we'll call this the task form, and then we'll have the task list. I think that makes a little bit more sense, right? So with that, we have our 3 components that we're going to need to create. So let's go ahead and start creating them. I'm going to just clear this up since we kind of already know what we're going to be doing here. And what I'm going to do is start putting some thoughts to these three components. Task form will be containing the form input and submit, and then the task list will be showing a list of the data returned from the form. And so the so yeah, that is kind of how that is on our end. And yeah, what the kind of importance is for this stuff here. So cool. So now that I kind of have the hierarchy and just thinking about this, right? The task form is gonna be the task form itself is gonna be a part of the task container as well as the task list. So these will be kind of subcomponents, right? Oops. I don't know how to get this on the same presentation. Let me do it like this. Right, so inside of the task container, we'll have these 2 other components. So let's go ahead and start building this components out. I'm gonna go ahead inside of this components folder. I'm just gonna create a new file called task container.js, right? And I'm also gonna create the other 2 components that we had. So that was task form.js, and one more I'm gonna call task list.js, right? So remember, I'm giving them these all the same names as what I'm gonna name the component. The .js is just me saying I'm gonna create they're gonna be their own file, et cetera, et cetera. So now that I have these 3 files created, I'm also going to make sure that I define them out in the way that is going to support what we're trying to do here. So first, I'm going to define out the task container. And since I'm kind of trying to prove this point of like using class-based things, we're gonna have to think about like how we're gonna structure these components out in general. If I go back to this little note I started, I want to just kind of pose the question early, which is, which of these components, right? We have 3 components: task container, task form, and task list, right? Each of these components we're going to end up needing to create, right? And remember what we were talking about earlier. that state is data that is going to have to change over time, right? So, and then props is data that might get passed from one component to another component. So I'm curious, drop in the chat, like, which component do you think is going to need state? Is the task, or which components might need to use state? If you need to think about it, like, which components do you think will need to use state? And which components do you think might need to use props? Nice. See some folks dropping it in the chat. Right. So it's an interesting question to think about early, is which components are going to need some data that's going to be changing over time. And we're going to kind of take a look and see what we can glean from this information. Our homie Eric said the form might need to use state. So that definitely might be the case. So we're going to have to take a look at that. And some of these other components might need the state or props as well. So we'll kind of think on that too. My homie Benjamin said, assuming the list grows, the list might need state, right? Like, well, yeah, if the list is growing and that means that the data inside of the list is changing, right? That might mean that we need some state for that as well. So that's a great point too. So good to kind of keep in top of mind. Awesome. So let's go ahead and build this thing out. And I'm going to start with the two lowest components that are the ones responsible for kind of showing the list, and then the one kind of the form. So for the list, I don't think it has to be super complicated. So I'm actually going to, let's just define these out as functional components, and as the components kind of change, if we need to use state, we'll turn them into like a class-based component so that we have some stuff to see. So I just want to kind of get some stuff to see on the screen, and we'll kind of take a look at that from there.
And
so
question, is it better to work from like inner out or outer in? Like, should you?
It doesn't really matter, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I think in this case, I'm just going to walk through it as an example, but certain moments you might realize it might be better to start at the top level component and work down. But if you think about it, this from even just this breakdown, right? This component is relying on these two components to be created so that it can show something. So I'm going to need these two components created in order to show what I'm going to need to show here, right? So in this case, it might be better to do like an inner out kind of thing. But depending on what you're building and what that's looking like, it might be better to do out or in.
All right, thank you. Sounds good.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. So inside of this container, I'm going to just define these as these components out real quick. And like I said, if we come to the point where we're like, oh, this component needs to use state, maybe I should make this a class-based component, we'll do that. So just to get the ball rolling, I'm going to make some functional components, call this task container. I'll just define all of them as functional components. Right, real quick, all this has to do, let's just return some JSX, says div, and the task container, right? And export this component. I don't need the semicolon, and should be good here. So I'm gonna save this, and I'm just gonna copy this into this these other components real quick. Just change this to say task form. Save that, and then the task list. And save that. So now I got these three components really quickly created. And that's the value of functional components, right? Is I can really quickly create them. So now that I have them created, what I'm going to do is kind of just extend this logic a little bit. First, I'm going to add the app.js to add the task container into here. So I'm going to import /component/task container, and inside of this app component, instead of just returning the empty div, I'm gonna return the gonna return the task container. Oops. Import task container from, there you go. Import this task container as a component as well. So cool, got this import to get this task container from this exported task container. Make sure these other two looking proper. Bet. And so save this, and I should expect to see something that says something along the lines of, hey, I'm the task container. Yep, and that's exactly what we see. Great. So now I have the task container created and it's also rendering. That's cool. It'll give me an opportunity to see these other components actually created over time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to swap out this return statement too, and just make it a little bit, make the app a little bit more structured, like how I really expect it to be, right? So I expect that the task container, inside of the task container, we're gonna want to make sure that we bring in the other components that we need to see in the task container. So that would be the task form from slash task form. So note that this changes, right? This import changes because being in a task container file, I'm inside of the components folder, right? And all these other files are inside the components folder as well. So I don't have to say /components. I could just say /task form because task container and task form are in the same folder. But VS Code really is really helpful with these imports. So just wanted to point that out. And I'm also going to import the task list and get that in there. And so what I'm going to do now is inside of this div, make sure that I kind of get this task form inside of here, and then also get the task list. And just to kind of add some, well, let me just do this as it is so we see what happens. Cool. So nothing to write home about, but I got like a simple kind of app that's returning this form, this container. If I looked at it in the inspector, it'll probably look a little bit more sophisticated, but just looking at the words might not look as as nice for us. So inside of our app, we have a div for our task container. That container is returning another div for the form and another div for the list, right? And clearly each of those are getting highlighted over time, right? So if I wanted to add some styles, I could add those to those different components. But right now we're just gonna play around with changing these things up so that they are a little bit more functional. So clearly the app's responsibility is to render the task container. The task container's responsibility is to actually do this interesting thing of rendering our task form and task list. So now let's kind of just get this task form to look a little bit more like what I expected it to look like. So I'm just gonna add this return statement. Dope. So this form, right, is going to just be a simple HTML form that is going to render the input and the button. So what I'm going to write here is, instead of this div, I'm going to just use a form. And the form is an HTML element also built into JSX. So you could, like we talked about, most HTML elements are turned into JSX elements for us. So I can make use of the form. If I was like confused about how would I make a form, right? I could go to the HTML form W3 Schools page. The W3 Schools just is a great resource for all things related to HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the web. And it has a lot of information about these forms, right? So I might not have known, there's a form element. So if I had looked up how to build a form in HTML, I would probably have gotten this resource as one of the first couple of resources. But so just as a recap of forms, also there's a really great section that I really encourage you to read in the React docs about forms, section 9 here. And it talks a lot about this stuff that we're going to talk about right now, but I just didn't want to give it away, OD. So I encourage you to read that on your own time as a recap to what we're about to talk about. But essentially, forms are an element in HTML. And because it's an element in HTML, it's clearly an element in JSX. But what forms do is forms are essentially like a little container element that wrap a number of different form elements. And there's a couple of different types of form elements. The main one that you got to be familiar with is the input element. And the input element is the element that we use to define like the item that will be inside of the form, whether that's text, like a single line kind of input, text input, radio buttons, checkboxes, submits are like a button that is like kind of displayed as a submit button, and then a regular button, right? And so these elements are used with the same, this input element is the same across the board, but when you change the type attribute, you get a different type of element, right? So clearly changing the type to text, type to radio, type to checkbox, etc., changes what element you eventually see. And so here's an example of a form that has an input with a label, and that label kind of says something specific, but then the form itself is just kind of these two input boxes. And, you know, kind of, if you walk through this form, HTML form thing, it'll kind of teach you a little bit more about forms. But clearly what we need to do is like add some inputs to this form and connect it that way. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and do that. So instead of this text that says I'm the task form, I'm going to add an input, give it the type text, and let's just start it at that for now. Save to see what goes on here. And clearly this changed into a little input for us. It's kind of a little hard to see this stuff. Might be helpful to put some styling in here, but I'll save that for the end. But either way, I'm gonna just zoom in maybe a couple times so we can see a little better. So I got this little form input, and yeah, next thing I needed for this form is a little submit button. So a couple things, since I'm using a form, I could use the submit button that they talked about here, which is an input with the type of submit. It says it'll display a submit button for submitting the form. And so I could do that, or I could use the input type button to display a button. I could use these items here, or I could just use a regular button. For the sake of this example, I'm just going to use a regular button, and I'm going to just use a regular button and kind of give it the name submit, and just kind of see here. Cool. So now I have form, submit button. When I click, something happened. I think because it's already inside of the form. But either way, this is kind of set up and doing what you would expect it to do. Just for the sake of just checking this out, I'm just going to give this input type button and just kind of see what happens with this if I did it this way. Oh, I did it the wrong way, so it give me an error probably.
Single tag, right?
Say what again?
Is it a single self-closing tag, or?
Probably, and it probably uses a different value or something for the name or something. Let's see. Yeah, okay, there it is. So if I wanted to use the input type button, I could do it this way. If I wanted to use the input type submit, I could do it this way. And clearly those are the same thing, right? Again, I'm gonna just use a regular button to just make the point kind of that these are different JSX elements. And we'll work with that in a second. Cool, so great, I got the form up. I just gotta be able to type in here and then submit. Now, this task list is kind of also probably a pretty straightforward component. Instead of just having this text, maybe I'm gonna have a set of items that come back in this div. And so it might end up looking like a list of items. Well, turns out there's a HTML element for lists, right? There's a whole lot of HTML elements, but there's definitely one for lists. And if you look at the kind of element breakdown of how that is structured, right, there's two types of lists, an unordered list and an ordered list. An unordered list is just bullet points. Ordered list is, 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing. Each list has a container kind of tag and then the list item tag. The container tag changes. If you're using an unordered list, it's UL for unordered list. If you're using an ordered list, it's OL for ordered list. But each of them uses this LI tag as like to kind of differentiate the different elements. So in this case, I don't really need an ordered list. I'm going to use an unordered list, but I'm going to, so I want this unordered list to have different list items that will come back from the user. So for now, let's just kind of take a look at what that will look like. So inside of this div, I'm going to, do y'all sing when y'all code to each other? That's what I do. I just be singing to myself as I code. I'm gonna open up this unordered list, and then inside, I'm just gonna make a simple couple list items. I'm gonna say this is item 1. This is item 2, and then this is item 3. Cool. Save this, and our thing should have updated, and it did. It's definitely ugly with these styles, but hey, I'm not complaining. This is just an example. So cool. Clearly, we got the kind of structure we want, right? Now, all I want to be able to do is type something in here. Clearly, Michael Jackson took over my keyboard, press submit. And I would want to see that reflected down here. So let's figure out how we will make that happen in a React-based sense. So questions now are, what is responsible for what? And we already broke that down in here, right? Task container should contain all the application involving our form and a list of data. We got that, so that's a check. Task form contains the form input and submit. That's a check. Task list should show a list of the data returned from the form. Okay, so clearly the form has to pass some data into the task list. Now, in the chat, right? Think about what I just said. The form needs to pass some data into the task list. What type of data is that gonna be then? Type it in chat, type in chat. Let me know. What type of data? We talked about 2 types of data when we first started talking today. What type of data does one component pass to another component?
The JVM?
Yes, sir. The answer is props. So if you had props as the answer, you're thinking the right way. JSX, if that's what you're saying, is the syntax we use to define the elements. What we need to do is pass props from our task form into our task list, right? So this is an interesting scenario because this form has to make sure that this element list gets some data. And both of them are defined in our task container, right? Each of them are separate in their own kind of logic. The task form is a form doing what it has to do, and a task list is its own list, right? So question is, how are we going to actually connect these things, right? I could pass props. I know I can pass props into them, and then I can maybe like use props here in this task list or something. But how am I going to pass the props is a question. And then how am I going to update the props for this task from the form into the task list? And that's essentially what we're going to just talk about right now. So the question I had asked was, okay, when you think about how this application is working, this clearly up here is the form. So if I type in the form, here's a task, right? I want, when I submit this form, for this to update this. These are 2 separate components. This is the form, this is the list. So I said, I want the form to update the list. The data from the form needs to update the data from the list, which means I need to pass somehow this information into here. And like we said, the only way to pass information from one component to another component is with props. So I really want y'all to get this concept. I really want y'all to get this concept. Props is what we use to pass data from component to component. And we talked about props a couple of sessions ago, right? We even have the old thing for props here with this message component, right? And what we saw with the props was that we have to pass the prop in into the component from its parent component. So what component is the parent component of the task list in the task form? Which component is the parent component? We have 3 components. Y'all could type this in the chat. Which of these components is the parent component? Facts, exactly. A parent component is the component that is responsible for rendering the other component, right? So think of it like, which file is this component getting rendered in? Well, clearly our task form and our task list are being rendered actually inside of our task container. So the container is the parent component. And anytime you have this kind of hierarchy where one component is responsible for creating another component, this component becomes the parent component. Now, this is what is interesting. We can only define props from the parent component, right? So I have to do it from the task container. There's no other place where I can do this thing out. So that means that if I want to pass data into the task list, I need to do it in here, right? I need to do it in here. So maybe I do something like data, and I set it equal to some JavaScript data. And last question for y'all in the chat is, what data structure makes sense for like a list, a simple list of data? What data structure do y'all know about that would be great to hold, like if I want 5 elements in the thing, right? Bet. Yeah, y'all are Java heads, so y'all know like array lists and stuff. And JavaScript, it's all arrays. It's just arrays. So yeah, array would make perfect sense for this. So let's take a look at that, right? So if I wanted to create an array in JavaScript, right? It's very simple. An array is really just, I can define an array up here at the top of this function. So I'll just do that real quick. So I'll say, remember with JavaScript and the keywords, we say let to create a new variable. Now I'm gonna say let tasks, if I can spell, equal this array, right? And I'm gonna set this array with a couple of demo tasks. So I'm gonna say, let's keep them as strings, task 1, task 2, task 3. That's cool enough, right? We got three demo tasks, right? And we have this array. So technically, this is a JavaScript object, right? I could pass this array into this task list as props. I can do that a couple ways. I could either pass this variable I created, just kind of like this, right? Or if I didn't want to define a whole variable, I could do this, take this actual array object and pass it in like that, right? Both of those are acceptable because I'm passing clearly a JavaScript object. So I'm just gonna, for right now, let's actually use it as tasks, but hopefully you understand what I'm doing here is really passing this array into the task list with data. And remember, all I'm doing here is creating props. This I call data because I wanted to call it data. I could say tasks, but you know, if I call this thing tasks, or you know what I mean, that gets a little confusing. So I thought data makes sense for the prop name to be called data. So now that I have this prop being passed into the task list from the parent component, well, guess what? Now I can, oops, gotta comment this up back. Right now I got the this task being passed in. Why is this doing this? I think that's just a mistake. Yeah, okay, cool. Now that I have this task, this data prop being created, right? I can make use of this in this task list by using props, right? So inside of the task list, I can make use of props, right? And remember, functional components use props in a very easy way. So it's fine for us to use a functional component when we're working with props. It's just when we start messing around with state that functional components might not be the best option. So I can use props by really easily bringing props into this functional component, right? And then I could low key low-key try to change this item to render the props instead of just returning these demo list items. So here's a really cool thing that you can do with JavaScript arrays that is really important to know, is that you can map through JavaScript arrays to return some data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to essentially use an array helper function that is going to allow for us to take the items from this this dot prop. So remember that we're inside of here. I could do console log props dot data, right? In a functional component, we use props. You call props like this. We're not in a class. If we were in a class, we'd have to call it this dot props, right? But since we're in a functional component, we just call it props dot data. So if I save this and then just pull up the console real quick just to confirm, hopefully we see a console log in here that kind of returns the data that we expect to see here. Open the console. So cool, here's the array and here's our task. And that was props.content, props.data. So I could also add a message. This is coming from props. Right, so clearly this is the one coming from props and it's this array. So what you might want to do, right, which is a very common task for using arrays in React specifically, is using an array to map over some data and then return some JSX. So let me show you a little bit of what I mean by first going over to kind of talk to you about array maps real quick. Oops. So you can take your pick, whether you use the W3 Schools reference for this or you use the Mozilla developer reference for this. Any of these websites will talk to you about the map function in JavaScript. Excuse me, New York is New Yorking out here. Make sure I'm good. I bet. So the map function is a very important function in JavaScript. The whole idea is, with given some array, you can create a new array by mapping over the old array, and you can pass a function into the map function that will run and convert each element of this array into something different. So the idea with it is, say for instance, we have, these are like pretty OD examples, but let's look at the Mozilla network one. It probably has a simpler one. Yeah, so given this, like, pretend we have this array of numbers, right? The map function takes each number, each index of this array and runs a function on it. So here we're passing in an arrow function that is a very easy arrow function. Technically, if we wrote this as the whole arrow function, it looks something like this, right? Right, but this whole thing is a function that's passed into here. So this is, think of it like we've just passed a whole function into the map function itself, which is why we have these kind of double parentheses going on. But what this function does is it lets you define some value that is going to represent each index of this array. So, or each item in the array, excuse me, each element. So you can name that whatever you want. In this case, they named it X to represent each element as it kind of iterates through. But what this function does is clearly takes the square root, or not square root, but puts this up to the power of 2. Or what am I talking about? This is just multiplying it by 2. Y'all got me. I'm tweaking today. This is multiply this by 2. And what the array function is doing though is, so every value of this array is going to get is going to run through this map function. So it's going to say X is 1 when it first sees the first element. Clearly, it's going to return. So this is what it would really look like as a whole function, right? It's going to return X times 2, which in this case would be 1 times 2. So that's 2. So clearly, the map will run through all of the elements and it returns a new array. So it takes one array, it returns a new array, and then you can save that array as a value or something. It returns the new array. And that's how when we can console log it, we see that the array actually gets doubled, right? That's my bad because it's tweaking on me, but that's my fault because I messed up their little function. Right, so clearly this works. So that's essentially what we do a lot of the time with React is it's in this section about lists and keys, it'll actually talk to you a little bit more about that, the array map function, and how you can use the array map function to map through some items and render a list of items. And that's exactly what we're going to do here, is just basically take this list of items that we got as tasks and then just render them in our function. So what I'm going to do is just kind of do the same thing. So in a task list, I'm going to create a new let's just say list, and I'm going to give it the value of props.data.map, right? So this is clearly assuming that props.data exists. If it doesn't exist, there might be some errors. So we're gonna have to troubleshoot that. But for the sake of just finishing this up, what I'm gonna do is map over this data that we passed in. So remember, we're passing in this data from the task container. And I'm going to say for each, just kind of define an arrow function in here real quick. So each element I'm gonna call, I'm gonna just say task, right? So the name of this is just clearly an array of tasks, right? Of each one. So that's why I just named it task. But then what I want this to return is, this might be interesting for you to think about, but I don't want this to be an array of strings, right? Clearly with the way that the unordered list works, I need this to be list items, right? So I'm actually gonna return an entire JSX expression in here. So I'm going to return a list item with a with the parameter of the list or the data text inside of there to be a JavaScript element that is, the task, right here, right? So this line is saying take each task from this data list, right? And then return a new list item with that particular task's name as, text inside of this actual JSX expression. So this is a very interesting kind of little line, right? The data, the map, and then what's going on here, we're saving it as a list. So what I'm gonna do here is get rid of this, this like fake list data here, and I'm gonna just pass the list in here this way. So saving this, and then going back to our going back into here, I need to, props data map, maps through the list, return. Why did not show up for your boy?
Do you have to use a constructor or no?
No, because this is a functional component. It's something in the return of what's going on here. But what's this? I don't get why this is here. Why did it add this now? Okay, there it is. I had to just add the return into this line. So the map function takes a function, right? So clearly this whole thing is a function. So I just added the return for each line to make sure that it returns this thing the right way. So now this list variable, can be put back into, can be destructured, right? I could take the entire array because this is an array of JSX. I can pass it into this unordered list as data, right? So remember the unordered list before was just taking these list items one by one. Now it's taking those list items as an array that's created from this map function. Some pretty cool JavaScript stuff, if you ask me, but I'll definitely a little complicated. So definitely would refer y'all to these documents in the React docs, the list and keys one and the forms one, to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here. So now we're kind of in an interesting place. Clearly now our task container is going to pass the data into our task list. And now the only thing that remains is, okay, well, we need clearly for our task form to update this data. And the task form needs to kind of create the data that is going to be updated. So let's just set up our form real quick a little bit more. And we're going to have to talk about how does the form actually work, right? So there's a couple things I need to do. First thing is I need to be able to type into this box, and when I press submit, I should be able to see some data come back. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to create another function. So I'm just going to create a function as an arrow function here, and I'm just going to say let handle submit be set to this arrow function, right? And inside of, I'll just make this a constant actually. So I'll make this handle submit function. And then inside of here, right, what I want to do is when this button gets clicked, I want to see whatever is saved inside of this text box, right? So I just want to be able to kind of print this, right? So how am I going to do that? Well, okay, maybe I'm going to console.log something, right? And then when this button gets clicked, I'm going to say button on click, kind of like we did the other day. I'm going to pass handle submit, right? And my hope is that in the handle submit, let's start with that, that when this gets clicked, we see this console log. So let me open the inspector. We don't gotta worry about this right now, I'll fix that. But, oh, I press submit and we see something, but then all of a sudden the page reloads, which is a function of the form being kind of editing over time. So first thing we gotta know about event handler functions is this. Any event listener kind of attribute, so on click, on drag, on drop, on all of those events we talked about last session. Each of these event handlers, whenever they call their corresponding function that we pass into them, they pass a very specific object in that we saw when we built the tic-tac-toe game, right? It passes an object that we can name whatever we want, but typically you see people either name it event or E, just as a shorthand. But the event object is an object that gets called and sent over to us whenever this event happens. But one of the things that's happening right now is our page is reloading before we even can look at the data. So there's a specific method that you can use whenever this is the case, that you want to stop the page from reloading, and that is the event.prevent default function. Oops. So it comes off of this event object. So if you name this event, you say event here. If you name this E, you would say E here. So that's just so you know, kind of whenever you're looking at some code and you see that's what's happening here, is we're stopping the page reload, right? So let's rerun this. And clearly now the page isn't reloading. So we're seeing both this event object get passed back with the on click, and we're also seeing this in the handle submit that we expected to see as well. But now here's the important question. How do we get back the data from this input that is that's here, right? There's no attribute here that we make use of. There's no kind of information of what's whatever. So if clearly we can see that this is we can just see this is here. Let me just make this a little bigger, right? So if I was to be typing in here something random, right, and submit, like, how do I actually get to see what is going on in here, right? So the first thing you might think is, oh, maybe there's like a event, maybe there's like a corresponding kind of event thing that we can use. And one of the ones that you might hear about is the like if we were to go back to the HTML documentation, it'll talk to us about a little bit of those event handling things. And the case here is that, to make a long story short, in order to really save this information that's changing over time, right? Because clearly this text box input is changing over time. Well, what data do we use that changes over time, right? State. So we need to save this data somewhere that is going to change over time. So when we're working with forms, it is often the case that because of that, we're going to need to use some state to like keep track of what's happening inside of this input so that we can make use of it, right? And the interesting thing is how that happens. So for those of y'all who have to slide, I completely understand. You can totally take off. I'm gonna keep going, and it'll take a couple minutes to just finish this app up. But we'll see real quick that we're gonna have to add state to this application, and we're going to need to ensure that we connect those dots a little bit. So again, for those of y'all who have to slide, you'll be able to see the rest of this after I finish. But if you got a chance and you want to stick around for a little bit, that's cool. So let me just wrap this up real quick. So the thing is, with HTML inputs, there is a specific thing that we can take a look at inside of our object, our input element, that we can use to get information on what is saved inside of the particular at the input at particular time, right? So if I go back real quick to HTML form W3 schools and we look at the input, right? So clearly the input, when the input is taking in some text, right? We can like make use of the text that's coming back. Let's just look at this example from the W3 school so I can just show you how it would look in HTML. It's not going to show us unless we connected this to JavaScript. All right, don't worry about it. And basically what you need to know is that within forms, working with JavaScript and React, you need to make some way to keep track of the value of the input. If you're working with form inputs, you need to track the value. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this. One way is to give, so what we have to do in order to do this is make use of a specific attribute inside of the form called value. And this value allows us to set a value for the form. So if I particularly set this value to be form value, right? Or something, right? Or let's say sample task. Then whenever I call this handle submit function, I can actually take a look at the event target's value, which the target is referring to whatever thing triggered this event to be called. And so in this case, the thing triggering the event is the button. So event.target.value should return what the value is that we set here. So if I were to click this, submit, and inspect the console, my hope would be that if everything's right and I'm not bugging, whoops. Oh. Event.type.text. So the thing is that after it's reloaded, the value is kind of set back to, it's kind of wiped out. So this is why within forms and inputs, we need to use state to keep track of it. To make a long story short, when you work with forms, you need to use state. So because I'm going to use state, I have to change this component up. I'm not going to talk to you about hooks right now, because like I said, it's a little easier to just do this with classes. So I'm going to just convert this functional component to a class-based component real quick so that we can use state. So I'm just going to do that real quick by importing React from React at the top here and changing this declaration to, instead of saying function, I'm going to say class task form extends react.component, right? And in order to switch over a functional component to a class-based one, I just got to get rid of these keywords before my functions. That's one thing I got to do. So handle submit won't have a const before it. It'll just be its own variable. And then in the return, I just got to wrap the return in a render statement, render function like this. Right, and boom, now my functional component is a class that quickly, right? I could add a constructor, which I will do, but just to show you that it's working, I'll just reset handle submit is not defined. Oh, so the other thing is once I make this a class, remember I got to call this dot on my functions. So this dot handle submit is what I need to call here. So, okay, boom. So we're back at, whoops, this is just tweaking. Cool, so we're back here in this example. I'm getting this error about this unique key thing from when we do our map function up here. So typically when you do a map function, you need to kind of return a unique key for your items. So I'm gonna just do is just extend this map function a little bit. Every map function allows you to also get not only the element from the array, but the index that it's looking at. So I'm just gonna do that to create a new key in here and just pass the index as the key, just to get rid of that error for myself because I hate seeing random errors for no reason. Provide a value prop to a form field without an on-change handler, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna actually see that real quick. So clearly my class-based task form is working. So what I wanna do is, like I was saying, is I wanna actually make use of some state inside of here to see what is out to actually oh, I see why this wasn't working. Oh, I got it. So I want to actually see what's going on inside of the data changing over time, right? So when this handle submit is being updated, I want to be able to kind of to see the state of this input changing. And prior to that, the reason that my button wasn't working, this is kind of returning blank, is because right now my handle submit, I'm calling event.target.value, but the target that I'm looking at when this button gets called is the button, but the value that I want to see is actually the input. So the question wasn't about seeing this event.target value here. It was to see how am I going to get this inputs value to be read, right? And that's a little bit more difficult. So clearly I'm going to need to make use of some variable that's going to hold the value of this input as it changes. The thing about inputs that's unique is that inputs have another handler that we can make use of called onChange. And onChange is a function that gets called whenever an input is being pressed. So I'm just going to say handle input change as another function. I'm going to put the pass the event object in there. And clearly inside of here, what I'm going to do is just one event.prevent default just in case. And then event, console log the event.target so we can see kind of what's going on. Cool. So before I do this, let me just get rid of this value here so you guys can see what happens. Whoa. On click this dot handle submit. Oh, I gotta pass this function in here. This dot handle input change. Cool. So as I type now, right? A random task, right? So clearly the event.target.value from the task input is calling this function handle input change, which is console logging the event value over time. But the thing is that as this event.target value is updating, that's great. But how am I going to actually like get a reference to it when I'm ready to call this button here? Because they're clearly two different event targets, right? One is this input and one is the button. So this is why using state is going to be important. Rather than just console log this event.target.value, I'm going to want to make store a reference to it, right? And so of course I can so in order to do that, right, what I'm going to do is add some state. So I'm going to just create a constructor, and in the constructor, just as a default, initialize the base component. And then in here, I'm going to create some state. So I'm going to say this.state, and I'm set it equal to a new object, right? And that object is going to hold some data for my form, right? It's going to hold some data related to whatever is in the input. So I'm just going to call it input data for now. Give it a key of an empty string. And that's pretty cool. So now whenever handle input change gets called and the event.target.value updates a bit, rather than just console log this, I'm also going to say this.setState, right? To set the state so that our input data is updated with the event.target.value. So now, not only is this going to update as it's getting called, it's going to set the state and update the state as well, which is great because now that that's done, that means that hopefully I should be able to, inside of my handle submit, I should be able to see this.state.input data represent the last thing saved inside of the input. So I'm just gonna say this is handle submit. Print that, get rid of this. Cool. So now that this is reloaded, I'm just gonna say, hey, a new task, right? And then submit. And then clearly this is a handle submit, and it should have printed the other John. This.state.input data. Whoops, maybe I have to do this. Oh, I got it. So the thing is that in order for us to connect the form to completely work, right, the last thing we have to do is make it so that the value of the form knows that it's going to be set to, it's going to be setting the state so that we can also see this change over time. This is so interesting. Like, so inside of our input, what we're going to set the value to be set to is also set to our state, so that it's going to know to change the value based on what's set in the state. So this.state.input data is what we're setting the value to be, so that the form knows, okay, cool. Every time you update this input data, so that we can eventually make use of this.state.input data once this value changes here. So now everything should work as we expected. Whoa. I think my John was tweaking, bro.
Yeah, I think we're missing something because the same thing's happening for me.
Yeah, I'm like, wait, wait 2 seconds. So we got the input, got our text, got our value, our unchanged, this.handle input change. Handle input change is clearly getting called. The console log is working, and our set state should be setting our state, but this is what was tweaking, was this wasn't working. Oh, this is why. Oops, this is why. Ooh, man, they don't call me Bugmaster Cam for no reason. It's because set state's a function, and I didn't call it like a function. I called it like it was a variable. Whew, man. Do not let them revoke my license. But there it is. This.set state is supposed to be a function that passes in the new state. So that was the problem. The state was never updating from this empty string that I had as a default because it wasn't actually doing anything. Cool. So now, yeah, cool. Random task, right? So now this is working. When I submit, if I look at the and if I inspect the console now, clearly it's actually passing that thing that I typed in. So I could type something else, right? And there it is. So cool. Next step is done. We have our form being able to kind of keep track of the data that is changing. And so now the last step is, okay, our form is ready to actually send some data to our task list. How are we going to make this happen? Well, this is where I was trying to mention at the beginning of the session that things get a little interesting when you start trying to pass data from one component to another. That is one component. This component is using state, right? But clearly this other task list is expecting props. So we need to pass the state somewhere that can pass it to our component. So our form needs to be able to pass this state somewhere else to be passed into our task list, because clearly we can't set the props for task list inside of the task form. The only place we can do that is in the task container. So this is where things get very interesting for this, how this application is supposed to get structured, right? Clearly our task container, we define like a random list of tasks and we pass those tasks in as data, props data to our task list, right? So our task container is really what's defining the task that we see on the screen. But the task form is the component that's responsible for updating the data, right? So once this data gets updated, we gotta somehow let the task container know, and then let the task container update the data for the task list somehow, right? And pass the props into the task list. So this is where you see an example of a component that's going to need to make use of a couple of different things for state and for props. So let's just finish this app up and see this very interesting architecture, which comes up all the time in React, which is the idea of passing up state, which is also one of the topics that is inside of the React docs. It's called lifting state up. And when you look at this section, you'll understand a little bit more of what we're talking about with this next part of the of our finishing this build up. So clearly I have this task form holding the state of the form, right? So now when I handle submit, right, I can also console log that I'm ready with this data. So what I want to do is, let the task container know and send data, right? That's what I want to do. So how am I going to do that, right? This is an interesting question. Somehow I need to be able to refer back to my parent and be like, hey, yo, notification, hey, something, right? So I want to talk to my parent component. So what do I got to do? Remember what I told y'all before? If one component wants to talk to another component or send data to another component, what method of that do we need to use? What's the React thing we got to use in order to send data between two components? If you thought props, you're correct. That's exactly what it is. So we need to be able to send props over to this component. So this is where things get a little interesting. I want to be able to pass some props from my task form to my task container. I want to be able to send data from my task form to my task container. But the only way these two components can talk is via props. So technically, I need to pass some prop in here to my task form that it can make use of, and then maybe send a notification or something back to me. So this is an example that happens all the time in these React components, wherein you pass a function as props to another component. So let me show you what I kind of mean here. So say, for instance, I create a new function, and I call this function handle new task, right? I'm gonna make it an arrow function because I like those. And inside of this function, right, all this function is gonna do, this function is just a function that I created, right? And what I want this function to do is console log something. Let's say, for instance, that this function is gonna get back some data, right? And I'm gonna console log that data, right? That's essentially what this function is gonna do. But here's where things get interesting. I'm going to pass this function into my task form as a prop. So I'm going to say on new task or something. I'm just going to name it something interesting. So cool. So I have on new task as the name of the prop. Remember, with props, I got to open some curly braces, and then I can pass any JavaScript thing into here. So what I'm going to pass into here is this function, handle new task, right? So basically I'm saying, hey, task form, you have a new prop called onNewTask that actually is this function that I created here. But you can use it as a prop. So now inside of my task form, I can make use of this new prop that I just got passed inside of my logic here. So I could call props anywhere, right? But remember, I'm in this class-based task form. So I would argue that where I need to call that function would be here, where I'm handling the submit to let the task container know. So that's exactly what I'll do. I'll say this dot props dot on, I forgot already what I named it, on new task, right? So I got to remember what this prop was called. So on new task, and I'm just going to pass this dot state dot input data, right? Because this is the actual task that I want to pass back. So I'm going to just put this function here and let's just see what happens. So now, technically, remember, this function is defined in the parent, but I passed it to the child as a prop. And so when this function, when this submit button gets clicked, right? So I'm gonna say new task, press submit. Clearly, new task is printed out in the task container, right? So that prop worked, that little passing of prop. So let's just add that into the console log. I'm gonna say console log child returned this data, right? So we know that that data is coming from the child component. It's coming back from our form, right? Our task form is passing this back up. So cool. Well, this is an interesting scenario that you're going to come across a bunch of times where, you know, we use props to pass data in the sense of variables and data, but also you use props to pass functions, which gets really important when you're trying to have two components communicate too. So if I wanted this component to talk to its parent, I need to pass some function that is defined in the parent that will get called from the child. And that's exactly what we just did here. So now last step is this. Now I have the task form hitting us back up and saying, hey, yo, I'm ready with some data. And it's printing this data, right? And now I want this data to be updated for this task list. But last question of the night is, what type of data do I need to use if data is going to be changing? Clearly, the data for this array of tasks is going to be changing, right? So what type of React-like data do I need to use to deal with data that's changing? Right, I got to use the state 100%. So again, oh shit, I'm using state. Damn, I probably should have made this a class-based component, right? But you know, at the end of the day, you don't know these things until you're in the middle of them. Right? I knew from the jump, but I just wanted to show you too that sometimes you'd be working on the components and you're like, oh, well, maybe I need to make this component use state now. And until you know about hooks, it makes more sense to just turn this into a class. So let's just do that real quick. Last one. So import React from React. Change this function to class task container extends react.component, right? Get rid of those braces. Because this is a class, I don't need to have these keywords for the variables I'm defining, but I don't even want to have, I don't need the keywords for any of the variables or the functions. So I'm just gonna get rid of them real quick, and then I'm gonna actually come back here and change this top line up a bit. So get rid of these stuff here. The return, I need to just wrap in a render function. So fix that. Just make this look a little nicer by just tabbing this over. And then, yeah. But then, because handle task, new task is defined in the class, I need to make sure I call this dot inside of here. And yeah, now everything should be decent. But first, what I want to do is I want to, clearly, I don't want the task to just be this hard-coded array, right? I want to pass that as some data that's going to change over time, especially because we have this function that is data coming back from task form, right? So because this data is going to be changing, I want to make sure that this component has some state tied to it that can track that, right? So I'm just gonna real quick create a constructor, inside a constructor, initialize it. And I'm just gonna create a new state object real quick, this.state, and I'm going to set data to an empty array, right? There's no items when it first initializes. But after every time handle new task is called, I'm just going to say this dot set state, right? And I'm going to pass the new state where data is going to be this array, right, of data has to kind of get updated some, right? So here's like some stuff you can do when you're dealing with state that's changing an array. The easiest thing you can do is get a reference to the old state. So I'm saying let old data get this dot state dot old data or something, right? And then I could pass in, I could do like old data dot append and append this data that's coming back from the task. Maybe I should change this. Instead of saying data, I'll just call this task so that it just makes a little bit more sense in this kind of little function here. But clearly I'm just I'm getting the old data from the dis.state that's set already, and I'm just appending to that array a new task to it, right? And hopefully that will just add to the data that is already there. So that's one way to do it. There's a bunch of ways to do this in JavaScript. I think just for the sake of wrapping this up, because I'm already taking a lot of time, let's just do that. So getting an error here, let's just make sure task is not defined. Did I define tasks? Oh, so last thing I got to do, right, is clearly I'm not making use of this hard-coded array anymore. I want to pass this.state.tasks to, oh, I should call this task. This.state.tasks into this array. So this.state.task is the array of tasks, right? And whenever handle new task comes back from the task form, we're going to get the old data from this.state.task. We're just going to append to it, append a new task to it, and set the state with that new data. Let's just call tasks. So this.state.tasks gets updated in the handle new task function. And then we also pass this.state.tasks as a prop into our task list. So this is also where we see that connection of props and state. Here, I'm passing what is in this component, this is state. But as soon as I call this.state.tasks and pass it as a prop like this, well, the task list doesn't even care. It doesn't know that that was state. It just knows, hey, I got a prop called data, right? And I'm going to make use of it, right? So that is how we pass state as props to certain components as well. So let's save this and see if everything's working as expected. Clearly, we don't have any tasks down there. So let me just close this up some, zoom in for y'all. So we don't have any tasks down there. So let's try setting task 1. Oops, old data.append is not a function. Excuse me, y'all. Let's just say old data.push. Maybe I just don't know my array functions. Testing, task. Damn, props.data.map. Okay, now I'm getting all the errors out of nowhere. It's almost like it doesn't think this is an array. Why doesn't this think this is an array? Old data task, we set this equal to be an array. Data.push, that should be fine. This.state.tasks. Wonder if, interesting. Props.data.map is not a function. The data is an array, should be an array. Damn, y'all. Right when I'm about to get my glory, on my glory days here. Let me see, maybe I got something messed up here. Handle new task, pass the new task, let old data get this.state.task, tasks, old data.push. Let me just console log this. And let me cons. Check this console real quick. Let's just make sure we're getting an array coming back. Okay. All right, so that's working. So then it's just this other function that's not working. Push the task isn't working. Whoops. So let me just try this way as a different syntax. Let's see if this works. And I'll explain what's going on in there. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm just gonna use this other syntax for pushing to an array. I don't know why that other one wasn't working OD, but I just don't want to waste too much more time. This syntax here is the array destructuring syntax in JavaScript. So you can do this really cool destructuring syntax with JavaScript for arrays and objects, where essentially you can say, hey, this ... says take all the elements inside of this other array, spread them out basically, and then inside of this new array, spread all those elements out from the old array, and then clearly another comma will say, then add another element, which is this task. So this is the same thing as me just trying to add to the back of that array. I don't know why, but the other syntax wasn't working. So I would just have to take a look at that. I think the reason why, now that I think about it, is that array.push takes I think array.push. No, should have worked. I don't know. Interesting. But so yeah, I'm just gonna take this and put that here, and hopefully that just fixes our problem and we can see our Jawns updating. Cool. So there it is. Let me just close this. All right, so now I'm just editing these tasks, and clearly I'm getting this list coming back. And just as a recap, all of this is happening because our task container is holding some state for our tasks. We passed in a prop to our new task list because we knew that we needed to pass that list of data into our task list. But instead of just defining a hard-coded array, we defined it as state, which means that every time this state changes, this prop changes for this task list, which is why this application is able to work the way it works now. The task form we spent a good amount of time on, but this is also an example of using state in like a form-like context. With forms, it just gets interesting when you're trying to keep track of the data from your inputs. You always need some state to keep track of your different data from your inputs. So we created a handle change function that was tied to our input that was updating the state every time. And we also set the value of our form input to be whatever the state is, so we can see that change over time. So that's where the set state is coming from. And then the handle submit is coming from the button when we're finally ready to submit. And it is taking the state that we just set and passing it back to our parent with this props that was passed in from the task container. Task list isn't doing anything extraordinary except for using this array map syntax to take the props from the parent that we're getting back as an array, right? And mapping through the array, taking each element from that array and creating a list item out of it. And with that list item, we're able to actually pass that into this JavaScript, this JSX expression here very, very eloquently, so that as this thing updates in the state from the task container, right? All of the props that get passed to the task list get changed, and the task list is going to render whatever that new list is very eloquently there. And that's really it. That's our little application that's kind of connecting state and props. I'm sorry that I got kind of thrown off right here toward the end with the with the pushing of the data. But I'm gonna spend some time to figure that out later. But I just didn't want to hold us up too long. But I'll put this code up. Actually, let me just do that real quick. I'm gonna just add this changes and make sure okay, yeah. Add those changes, and then I'm just gonna make sure I leave a commit message and say creating task components. And cool. And then I'm just gonna push this to my development branch. And I don't know why this is tweaking like this. Interesting. Anyway, I'm gonna push this to GitHub. I'll push this to GitHub and make sure that y'all can get access to it from that components resource in a second. But yeah, thank y'all so much for damn. Oh, wait. Oh, okay, bet. Thank y'all so much for sticking by and like kind of taking a look at all of this. Appreciate y'all for your patience. And again, I'm gonna put the files up there and everything. For those of y'all who stuck with me, I'll just let you know now that yeah, this is a pretty common design pattern in React that we see often. And it's definitely something we're going to take a look at a lot of times in the future. So